Greetings, everyone. Here are the latest analyses of today's important developments. Hot geopolitical news, a 6-week verdict, and the terrifying collapse of the Tehran Empire. When the last giant ships off Karg Island are finally filled with crude oil and can no longer hold any more, the lifeblood of the entire Iranian economy will officially be permanently frozen. A silent but unprecedentedly ruthless stranglehold from Washington. The Revolutionary Guards seized power and took the nation hostage. Meanwhile, the supreme leader has fallen into a coma, and the president has been completely neutralized. The military hawks have swept aside the civilian government to plunge into a brutal power struggle in the shadows. It's a cruel paradox unfolding. How can they maintain the loyalty of the soldiers and govern a nation when the treasury is completely empty and the army is deserting en masse? Red alert in the Middle East as the door to diplomacy closes and the nuclear fuse begins to ignite. The aggressive and dominant rise of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is pushing the entire Middle East region into an unprecedented spiral of chaos and loss of control. As every negotiation effort is sabotaged by the military faction itself, the world is holding its breath, waiting for a devastating preemptive strike from Israel and a fierce nuclear arms race among neighboring powers. Here is the content and detailed analysis. The Revolutionary Guard is driving Iran to the nuclear threshold as talks have failed, and Israel readies a preemptive strike. Ladies and gentlemen, an empire does not necessarily collapse under the heat of disaster, but sometimes it fades away in the terrifying silence of an economic vise tightening day by day. On the turbulent geopolitical chessboard, the Tehran regime is witnessing its own system paralyze itself right before the eyes of the world at a dizzying speed. They once made bold claims about their resilient endurance, spending years building their entire survival strategy around scenarios of fierce armed conflict and guerrilla warfare tactics. Perhaps just like Russia, they appear formidable and strong on the outside, but when real conflict arises, everything is very different. In Iran, the nation's lifeblood is being suffocated by Washington's strategy under President Donald Trump, which uses a pragmatic and cold-blooded approach without firing a single bullet. Instead of spending billions of dollars on advanced cruise missiles or risking Air Force losses to bomb oil refineries, they chose to quietly tighten the financial noose. This tactic does not give Tehran any excuse or outside threat to stir up nationalist sentiment among the people who are already extremely agitated and unstable. According to the latest satellite data and open-source intelligence analysis, Iran's system has less than 6 weeks left before it reaches the point of complete collapse under suffocating pressure. Former President Donald Trump once warned that the country's oil pipelines are nearing their limits, bearing maximum capacity and could explode at any moment. Tehran's onshore crude oil storage tanks are completely overloaded, forcing the government to take a desperate step by pumping extracted oil directly onto supertankers anchored offshore. In the oil and gas industry, this is called floating storage, an emergency measure, a temporary painkiller to delay the system's day of reckoning. The giant ships drifting offshore are not there to transport black gold to sustain the economy, but merely serve as temporary oxygen tanks to relieve the critical pressure on domestic facilities, trying to keep oil wells running. But this lifeline can only buy Tehran an additional 2 to 6 short weeks. When this floating storage limit is reached, the real catastrophe will officially begin. Therefore, the fact that storage facilities from land to sea are all sending overload warning signals, it is the death knell for Iran's oil industry. Leaked information from the reputable daily Wall Street Journal shows that the Donald Trump administration decided to extend the blockade indefinitely, leaving Tehran with no honorable way out. So Iran's economy is being left to collapse under its own enormous weight. When the economic lifeline stops flowing, the first dominoes begin to fall, directly impacting the daily meals of innocent people with harsh consequences. Inflation in this country has skyrocketed to a staggering 67%. The local currency has depreciated terribly, causing more than 2 million people to become unemployed, turning daily life into a real battle for survival. To ensure a basic standard of living, the government had to issue emergency food vouchers valued at just $7 per person. Imagine, in an economy where the monthly minimum wage hovers around $130, but a regular piece of cheese already costs $5. That pain doesn't stop at the poor corners of the city. It's quietly infiltrating deep into the very core of the security apparatus. A regime may begin with an ideology, but to survive in the long run, it must rely on a solid financial foundation. The day you can no longer pay the soldiers who protect you is also the day your supreme power begins to shake at its very roots. Many reliable field intelligence sources confirm that the Iranian police force has been continuously owed salaries, while regular army soldiers have gone for months without seeing any pay at all. When the regime's guardians are faced with their family's hunger, loyalty becomes a luxury. Clearly, this is no longer just a logistical crisis or a temporary bottleneck. This harsh mathematical reality shows that when the last offshore oil tanks are filled, Tehran will not only face financial exhaustion, but also an existential collapse of an entire political regime that once shook the region. What an enormous strategic illusion. When people expect soldiers and police officers who can't even bring home a loaf of bread for their families to be willing to clash violently with their own compatriots on the streets just to protect the survival of a regime, at this very moment, the shadow of collapse is looming as waves of desertion at all levels within Iran's security forces are increasing at an alarming rate. The erosion of trust and the breakdown of discipline in the regular army are ironclad evidence that this system is rotting from within. The vulnerability and fragility within the state apparatus are gradually sowing the first seeds for a large-scale uprising that is about to erupt. Delayed salaries and money that never reaches the soldiers not only lead to isolated cases of desertion, but more dangerously, are severely weakening the entire chain of command at the highest levels. The strict sanctions imposed by the United States are also leaving extremely costly bills weighing heavily on global markets. According to in-depth analyses compiled by the reputable Wall Street Journal from international market data, gasoline prices in the U.S. domestic market have soared to $4.18 per gallon, creating significant economic pressure on many consumers in the land of the stars and stripes. At the same time, global fertilizer prices have skyrocketed, rising more than 90% compared to pre-crisis levels. This directly threatens the agriculture of many countries. Global supply chains are suffering deep wounds from this geopolitical shock. However, the Washington administration considers these losses a worthy strategic price to pay, and they have actively chosen to bear that burden. The Iranian government is still betting that the United States will soon grow weary of global economic turmoil and will be forced to loosen its grip. The White House's decisions to indefinitely extend the sanctions have poured cold water on this risky gamble by Tehran. As the 6-week window of time narrows, the severe internal cash crunch is fueling a completely chaotic atmosphere. Desperate people are jostling to withdraw the little savings they have left from the banks. Access to basic necessities has come to a standstill, and the uncertainty spreading throughout the streets is causing the state's civil authority to evaporate at a dizzying speed. While the economic crisis is ravaging the streets, a brutal and relentless power struggle is taking place in the dark, closed political corridors of Tehran. Instead of seeing a unified state apparatus rallying around a single, unified will in this critical moment, the situation in Iran is moving in the completely opposite direction. Seismic rifts are dividing the civilian government faction and the military faction, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is fracturing with ominous, thunderous rumbles. The civilian leaders, seeing the looming storm, are doing their best to keep diplomatic channels open, clinging to the faint hope of stopping the economic bleeding and bringing some relief to the exhausted nation. Just as reported in Al Jazeera's crisis bulletin on April 12, 2026, the directive from Iran's foreign minister to open the Strait of Hormuz for civilian ships is a clear example of this pragmatic and determined approach. Those reasonable and calculated steps by the civilian government were immediately sabotaged without hesitation by the military hawks. On the very same day that the foreign minister issued the directive, the Navy of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps made an extremely radical decision to attack ships in the area and firmly keep the strait closed. This shows that the internal rift had reached its peak, where the civilian government completely lost the initiative to make vital decisions. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran used force to seize control of the country from the hands of civilian politicians. From the president and parliament to Iran's diplomats, They are increasingly isolated from strategic decision-making. However, the military faction's seizure of power contains a paradox that cannot be resolved on its own. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran has seized the power of life and death over the nation. However, they completely lack the economic resources needed to sustain the massive apparatus they have just taken over. From paying salaries to millions of civil servants to maintaining basic public services. Holding supreme power when the national treasury is completely empty means they have to bear all the extremely costly political and social consequences that this crisis brings. On one side of the internal front, civil officials who want to sit at the negotiating table to ease the sanctions are waiting in utter helplessness. On the other side, the hardline military commanders, those who see compromise as cowardly betrayal, are doing everything they can to maintain the status quo. On the diplomatic front, Tehran's desperate efforts are crashing into the cold, icy wall that Washington has painstakingly built. As diplomatic reports published by CNBC on May 1, 2026 show, Iran is trying every possible way to buy time and break the deadlock by delivering new ceasefire proposals through Pakistan as an intermediary. Although these diplomatic initiatives may cause some short-term fluctuations in global financial markets, they cannot change the harsh reality unfolding on the ground. President Donald Trump's administration did not conduct traditional negotiations. On the contrary, they are shaping the entire situation according to their own strategic objectives. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the collapse of the Gaddafi regime in Libya in 2011, or the survival of the Assad regime in Syria in 2024, essentially both stem from the deep cracks caused by the financial crisis within the security apparatus. In Iran at this moment, the clock of fate is also ticking according to a similarly ruthless mechanism. The answer to the question of what will happen after the crude oil tanks are completely overflowing is extremely clear. The production lines will have to stop. The last drops of foreign currency flowing into the national treasury will completely dry up, and the economy will begin to collapse. It starts right from the very core of the security apparatus protecting the regime. The suffocating siege that is pushing the entire system into a deadlock with no way out is quickly eroding Iran's very capacity to survive. The giant oil tankers still anchored off distant islands are, in reality, nothing more than fleeting illusions that can only delay the inevitable tragic end already predetermined for the regime. Geopolitical and economic analysis data have revealed an undeniable mathematical truth. This country's oil storage capacity will reach its absolute limit in less than 6 weeks. However, as these 6 critical weeks are gradually passing by, the pressing question arises. What real force is holding this entire nation hostage from within? And why are they able to stand by and watch this destruction unfold without taking any action to save it? When we connect all those complicated developments together, a systemic structural reality gradually emerges. We can no longer analyze Iran as a normal country using conventional theories. Through the lens of conventional politics, Iran is now an abnormal structure where an extremely powerful paramilitary network holds decisive influence over both the armed forces and civilian political institutions. Right at the center of supreme power, the supreme leader is believed to have fallen into a deep coma and is completely unaware of the personnel arrangements happening around him. The actual power of President Masoud Pezeshkian has been reduced to a minimum, even though he is not actually under house arrest. Meanwhile, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, General Ahmed Vahidi, is unilaterally directing the war effort and actively suppressing all efforts to open diplomatic dialogue channels. Even Mohammad Badr Ghalibas, the head of the official negotiation delegation, despite his own background in the Revolutionary Guard, has been ruthlessly sidelined by the military hardliner faction. When we peel back this facade, what we see is no longer a country, but a brutal military organization wearing the cloak of a rule of law state. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not simply a regular army. It is also a massive economic force that dominates the entire country of Iran, a financial empire expanding its control from construction, telecommunications, petrochemicals to banking and finance. If peace is restored, the existence and interests of this empire will certainly be called into serious question. But if war and conflict continue, its octopus-like tentacles will reach farther and grip even tighter. This is the core reason that explains why rumors about house arrest orders, whether true or not, become extremely plausible in this context. For the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, peace and reconciliation with the outside world are much more frightening and dangerous than the economic collapse of an entire nation. Recently, 5 consecutive loud explosions shook the skies of Tehran in less than a minute. Immediately afterward, official sources from Iran quickly reassured the public that it was just a test of air defense systems and that there was absolutely no attack taking place. Even though this may have been just a routine drill, but the timing of it has raised extremely deep concerns. Rumors of a military coup, the collapse of ceasefire agreements, displays of cruise missile power, and emergency air defense drills. All of these happened in just a short 24-hour period. Iran seems to be urgently preparing for an all-out war, or they are trying to send a strong message to their own people that the government is still fully in control of the situation, or perhaps both scenarios are happening at the same time. This extreme vulnerability and fragility is turning Iran into a pawn that can be easily manipulated by external geopolitical actors. Both Russia and China may see the Revolutionary Guard as a more suitable partner because military regimes are often more predictable due to their rigid ideology. However, this extreme rigidity is actually depriving Iran of the minimum flexibility needed at the international diplomatic table, while also pushing the risk of conflict escalation to a red alert level at every crisis hotspot. Under the authoritarian and comprehensive control of the Revolutionary Guard, Iran's proxy forces, from Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, to militia groups in Iraq, will certainly be used in a much more aggressive and reckless manner. This scenario threatens to drag the entire Middle East region into a spiral of instability with no way out. Even more concerning is the country's nuclear dossier. The absolute dominance of the military faction could accelerate uranium enrichment activities, making any future nuclear agreements completely impossible. The extreme red lines set by hardliners like General Vahidi and Vachgia have completely stripped civilian diplomats of any room to maneuver. Iran approaching the threshold of possessing military nuclear weapons could ignite a fierce arms race throughout the region. Both Saudi Arabia and Turkey will face enormous pressure to develop their own nuclear programs. Meanwhile, the likelihood of a preemptive military strike from Israel is increasing day by day. Under the authoritarian rule of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the door to diplomacy has completely closed. The next 6 weeks will be a historic turning point that could completely redraw the geopolitical map of the entire Middle East. So in your opinion, what will Iran do next?